Hey, I'm new to Yu-Gi-Oh! And I was wondering, is this deck any good? This is a question I see a lot, and it's always a bit difficult to answer because it depends what you mean by good. Are you asking if a deck is good enough to win a major tournament, or good enough to play at locals? Now, some decks are really good to play with your friends. They're fun and interactive, but they won't get you very far up the Master Duel ladder. Other decks are really good for that, but are not fun for anyone involved. In the end, good is just not a very descriptive word, and dividing every possible deck into just two categories, good and not good, isn't all that useful, especially to newer players. And while I don't fault them for lacking a nuanced card game vocabulary, I do kind of fault the greater Yu-Gi-Oh! Community. Because even experienced players have a tendency to oversimplify the game, and categorize things as either good or garbage. At best, they might separate the good decks into a tier list with 2 or 3 levels of goodness, which is certainly an improvement, but it still dismisses the vast majority of cards as unplayable, which does a disservice to this game and the awesome variety it contains. We can do better. We can improve the way we talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! Not only so we can have more in-depth discussions within the community, but also so we can help new players join the community, so we can continue to build up this game that we all enjoy. In order to do that, though, we need to come up with a system that's more nuanced, more descriptive, a way to categorize decks that is useful both to experienced competitive players and newer casual ones. And while I'm not an authority in this community or anything, I do have a suggestion. 7 categories: meta, top, rogue, decent, casual, flawed, and unplayable. These 7 tiers encompass pretty much everything Yu-Gi-Oh! Has to offer, while also being fairly easy to define and understand. Meta is the highest tier, the undisputed strongest decks at the moment. While the name refers to the metagame, I find it helpful to pretend it's an acronym. The meta decks are the most effective tactics available, the very best builds you could play given the current ban list and the existing card pool. Now, some formats just have one meta deck, others have 2 or 3, but it's rare to see more than that at the very top spot. Regardless of the number, these decks set the bar for how powerful an archetype can be, to the point that all the other competitive tiers are defined by how they stack up against the meta. For example, the second highest tier is top, and it refers to all the decks that can consistently reach the top levels of serious tournaments. These are the decks that have no problem competing against the meta, but which just aren't quite strong enough to be the meta. Usually, if someone says a deck is tier 2 or tier 3, this is what they're talking about. There can often be 10 or more top decks in a given format, which is why many pro players will sometimes divide this section into multiple categories, usually based on minor differences in performance. That can be useful if you're diving deep into the competitive side of things, but for the sake of this broad overview, I don't really think we need these subdivisions. Anyway, next up is Rogue, which I define as any deck that can compete against the meta, but which has some factor which keeps it out of top contention. This can be a bad matchup against other top decks, a glaring weakness that can be exploited by experienced players, or it can just mean that the deck is really hard to pilot and it takes someone really skillful or really dedicated in order to get results. I'm not sure of the origins of the name, but to me it's always evoked the image of a sneaky rogue. You know, someone who appears without warning and then takes out opponents much stronger than them, usually by being unexpected. That's rogue decks in a nutshell. There's usually dozens of them in each format, but they rarely top events. And when they do, it's not consistently or in large numbers. There's always some amount of rogue decks that make it to top cut, but it's rarely the same decks every time, which makes them hard to prepare for. Now, before I go any further, I want to stop and say that if you're a competitive player, these 3 tiers, meta, top, and rogue, are probably the only things you really care about. These are the competitive tiers, the decks that make up the broader metagame. And if you're entering a tournament or trying to climb the Master Duel ladder, these are really the only things you need to prepare for, the only good decks worth considering. And while I think it's important for high-level players to understand that not everyone's goal is to win a tournament, and that lower-tier decks can be useful for a variety of reasons, it's also important for casual players to understand that this ranking system is about measuring a deck's success rate, not how cool or fun or popular it is. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the categories below Rogue. You can have a lot of fun with those decks, but you need to recognize their limits and be realistic about your goals. If what you want to do is win a tournament or climb the ladder, then you need to understand that even doing that with a Rogue deck is extremely difficult. Winning with anything lower is practically impossible. So with that in mind, let's talk about the 4 remaining tiers. The first is Decent, and you can think of this as the bridge between the 3 competitive tiers and the 3 non-competitive tiers. These are the decks that can hold their own against the meta and even occasionally win, but never consistently enough to actually top a tournament. Or to put it in Master Duel terms, these can't make it to the highest ranks, but they can still play against the decks that do without getting completely steamrolled. Now there's a lot of decent decks in this game. Almost anything released in the last 2 years is going to be at least decent, and oftentimes the goal of legacy support is to take an old, outdated archetype and make it decent by modern standards. Now from here, the categories stop being made in relation to the competitive scene, because frankly, none of them can put up a fight against the top decks. If we're just measuring these in comparison to the meta, then they're all bad. But when you're talking about casual matches between friends or decks that can be used to learn the game, then there's still some clear distinctions between archetypes that can be made based on how they work mechanically. Casual decks, for instance, are ones that have a cohesive playstyle and a solid win condition, but simply aren't strong enough to compete in the modern metagame. This is the resting place for all solidly designed archetypes that are now past their prime. Most high-tier decks will eventually work their way down here, which means there's an absolute ton of these, probably hundreds. And if you're trying to learn the game or just have fun with your friends, casual decks are a great place to start, because they can still give you a solid game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Even if their power level is far below the current competitive environment. After that, we have flawed decks. These are archetypes that are mechanically flawed in some way. Maybe they can put a bunch of monsters on board but have no real payoff, or maybe they do have a solid boss monster that they just struggle to summon consistently. Either way, these are the decks that you only really want to play if you're trying to handicap yourself, or if you just like the art and theming and don't care at all about playability. Now surprisingly, there aren't actually a ton of these in Yu-Gi-Oh!, maybe just a few dozen, because once Konami started designing cohesive archetypes, it was rare for them to make something that was just outright bad. Although it does still happen, and there is one tier that's even worse. Unplayable decks are the bottom of the barrel, archetypes which are substantially flawed to their very core, with no cohesive playstyle or win condition. Their boss monsters, if they even exist, lack the power to close out games, and even if you wanted to summon them, doing so is an ordeal. Now, like the top decks, there actually aren't that many of these, maybe just 10 or 20 in the whole game. Unplayable decks are the exception, not the rule. They stand out amongst their peers as the worst of the worst for a reason, because there's very few things that are as outright bad as these select few. Alright, so now that we have all these categories, what do we do with them? What's the purpose of coming up with these tiers and assigning them names? What's the point of all these vocabulary terms? To use them. Use the terms when you're discussing Yu-Gi-Oh! And try to keep it consistent so that they get adopted and understood by the community at large. That way, if someone asks you, like, I don't know, is Fluffle a good deck? You can tell them, yeah, it's probably decent, as like a go second OTK deck. You won't top a tournament with it, it's not competitive or anything, but it's pretty good at clearing the field and putting on 8,000 points of damage. So if you play some modern board breakers and get the right hand, you could maybe take a game or two against the top decks. Hopefully, now that we're all on the same page in terms of vocabulary, that made perfect sense to you. And hopefully it makes enough sense to new players that they understand as well. And even if you don't want to go that far in depth, just saying it's a decent deck but not competitive is still much more helpful and encouraging than just saying, no, it's bad. And if they have any follow-up questions, about what is good, what is meta, you should have the vocabulary to answer that quickly and easily as well. Now, of course, we won't always agree on what category each deck fits into. Maybe you think I'm being too generous and Fluffle is more of a casual deck. Maybe you've been testing it lately and you think it has the potential to be rogue this format. That's fine. These categories are purposely kind of vague, because the metagame is kind of vague. We can't mathematically determine which decks are meta, it's kind of based on vibes, I mean, there's testing and discussion involved, we do look at tournament results, but at the end of the day, it's just down to community consensus. And even when the community does agree on something, the metagame can shift pretty drastically from month to month. Sometimes a decent deck gets support that rockets it all the way into meta contention. Sometimes a ban list will kick a meta deck down to decent at best. Today's top deck is tomorrow's casual deck. That's just how time works in a game like this. The point of this video is not to say, here is the archetype hierarchy, every card has its clearly defined place. The point is just to provide a framework for discussion, a shared vocabulary that we can use when trying to explain the power of a deck or archetype, not just amongst ourselves in the community, but with outsiders as well. Hopefully this video has done that. It's implanted these words and ideas into your mind, given you a way of viewing and classifying Yu-Gi-Oh cards which goes beyond good and garbage. Thanks for watching, hit subscribe.